So, Skip, you've talked about the twin calamities that are plaguing our youth today. Can you talk a little bit about why you think they're related and what they are?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, Alan. Anybody who is in youth ministry, who pastors churches with young people, who is a theologian who cares about the well-being of the kids and the well-being of the churches has noticed what I call the twin calamity. Certainly every youth minister knows about them. And you can kind of frame it with an old preaching sermon illustration chestnut about the bridge. The story goes, there is a constable who goes to the stream down in his village, and what he notices, a body has washed up downstream in the middle of the village. This is a calamity and a sad thing for the villagers, but they all pitch in and they build a coffin and they hold the service and do the best they can by it. But a week later, another body comes washing down, and they do the same thing about chipping in and attending and participating. And this goes on week after week after week until finally the constable says, you know, rather than just wearing ourselves out here downstream, we ought to go upstream and see if there's something going on upstream that explains the catastrophes we're getting downstream. He takes a walk upstream, and about 2 miles upstream, he comes to a little part of the river where it's obvious that there had used to be a footbridge. But the footbridge has washed out, and there are footprints leading up to the old footbridge, but not to the other side. And he realizes people have been trying to cross the stream upstream, but have slipped in the currents and then perished and washed downstream. The next day, all the villagers troop upstream, and they build the footbridge and put it back into place, and they have solved the problem for a generation. The same phenomenon is going on for folks in churches. Anybody who's got their eyes open has noticed that there are twin calamities downstream in our parishes. The first is the widely reported, widely known, widely lamented phenomenon that we are having plummeting participation in our churches. Virtually all the mainline churches have been hemorrhaging members. We get the headlines in the main line, but even our Roman Catholic and our evangelical friends are beginning to see troubling phenomenon. And if you go upstream to try to understand why are we having these problems downstream, you realize, well, some of our biggest problems, and as multi-determined as the problem upstream is that we're not seeing our young people return to the churches when they age. So when you look at the statistics of millennials and Generation Xers, you're seeing these very, very significant declines in return to church, even as compared to previous generations. So what you've got is Generation Xers, those who kind of came along after the baby boomers, are much more likely to report that they have no religious affiliation as young adults did than the boomers. Then when the millennials come along, those who were born in about 1980, when you were expecting them to mature and come into churches around the year 2000, the turn of the millennium, they're coming into churches at even fewer numbers and having less affiliation than you've got in the Generation Xers. And if you go upstream and ask the question why, over and over again, the religious educators who study the question, Ken DeCressy Dean and others, are saying it's because we're failing to transmit the faith to our young when they're children and youth. And if you fail to transmit the faith to your young when they're children and youth, you should not be terribly surprised that they do not return when they are young adults. That's one calamity. Now there's a parallel calamity, and my contention is that it's related. The parallel calamity is that youth ministers, teachers, psychoadolescent, therapists who deal with adolescents and with children are finding we are having a terrible bloom of mental illness and dysfunction among our young. If you're downstream, you're seeing spiking numbers of kids who are suffering from depression, from suicidal ideation, from eating disorders, from anxiety disorders, from addictive behaviors. You know, we take our seniors out on a retreat every year and ask them what's their vision for the youth ministry for that year. And we get some fairly prosaic answers year after year. We want to have a more loving youth group. We want to be more inclusive of freshmen, et cetera. But one year they said, we are dying and there's no one to talk to about it. Well, what do you mean by you're dying? We are suffering unto death from depression, from suicide, from eating disorders, from body image problems, from anxiety disorders, from substance abuse issues, and from sexual behavior questions. And we're not going to talk to this to our health teacher about, and we're not going to talk to it to the football coach about, and we're for sure not going to tell our parents about it. We can't even talk to one another about it. Well, statistic after statistic is bearing out what these young people told us. We're seeing these spikes in dysfunction downstream. And when you go upstream, you find a rather startling cause of at least some of it. It's multi-determined like church participation is, but the National Commission on Children at Risk went upstream with psychotherapists and with neuroscientists, and what they found was, their conclusion was that there is a failure of communities to provide the nurture and connectedness that we have traditionally had in communities. And this breakdown in connectedness is what is causing a significant portion of the illness downstream. They recommended what they called authoritative communities. Now, these are neuroscientists and psychotherapists. They're not theologians and pastors. But when they described what they meant by an authoritative community, what they said was multi-generational, treats children as ends, not means, is led, at least in part, by lay people, not specialists, teaches children the importance of loving their neighbor, creates a nurturing environment, and lifts up questions of the meaning of life, and that we should treat others as you want to be treated yourself. Well, you know what they're describing as a failure upstream is the absence of church nurture. And as folks who study kids have found, the kind of nurture and meaning and reason for being and connectedness that used to happen in churches was what helped these kids transit through the vicissitudes of adolescent life. And when we fail to minister them and include them within our churches, we're failing to give them the environment they need for healthy development. So these twin calamities are related, and until we go upstream and get much more serious about transmitting the faith and creating a community of nurture and connectedness for young, we're going to see both dropping away from denominations, and we're going to see difficulties with adolescent health.